In the early morning of November 22nd, 1952, 5 friends from Millinocket, Maine set out on a week-long hunting trip to Allagash, Maine. The 5 friends have made this an annual event for the past 15 years, but this year would be different. Only one of them would return home. The 5 men, Ben Pearson, Jim Trafton, Jeff Romero, Andy Roberts, and Danny Myers, all worked together at Great Northern Paper Company in East Millinocket. It took the 5 men 3.5 hours to complete their 187-mile trip from Millinocket to Allagash. They would all stay in an old hunting cabin that was built by Jim Trafton's great-grandfather over 70 years ago. The cabin is surrounded by miles of dense forest and is completely cut off from civilization. The first night at the cabin went as it usually does. The men would stay up late drinking and telling each other the same stories they've been telling each other for the past 15 years. They would all wake up the next morning with horrible hangovers, but still managed to be in the woods by sunrise. On the 3rd night of their hunting trip, the men were woken up by something clawing at the outside of the cabin. The men, thinking it might be a bear, decided to stay in the cabin where it was safe. The next morning, as the men were leaving the cabin, they noticed claw marks on the front door. As they continued to look, they found marks on the back door of the cabin as well. But what the 5 men saw next made them wonder if what made the claw marks was a bear at all. Both trucks that the men drove to the hunting camp also had claw marks on them. Throughout the day, the 5 men debated on what could have made the strange claw marks. They have all seen what claw marks from a bear look like, but these were different. Whatever it was still out there, waiting to come back. That evening, the men had just finished their dinner. Jeff Romero told his friends that he was going outside to the outhouse. The outhouse sits about 60 feet from the cabin down a narrow path. 20 minutes after Jeff left the cabin, he still hadn't returned. Andy Roberts volunteered to go check on Jeff. When Andy returned to the cabin moments later, he had a very concerned look on his face. Jeff Romero was missing. The 4 men gathered their flashlights and guns and went outside to look for their friend. They called out Jeff's name over and over again as they walked down the dirt road that led away from the cabin. Darkness soon set in, but the men continued to search for Jeff. As they made their way down the long dirt road, they heard something that stopped them in their tracks. From somewhere in the darkness, they heard a man screaming. This wasn't an ordinary scream. This scream was octaves above what a man's scream should sound like. The men tried to figure out which direction the screams were coming from. They decided on a direction, then cautiously, in single file, they entered the pitch-black forest. The screams echoed throughout the trees and gradually became louder. The men knew they were getting closer. Ben Pearson led the group deeper into the darkness, followed by Jim Trafton, Danny Myers, and Andy Roberts at the end of the line. Danny heard a strange noise from behind him. Thinking it was Andy, he turned to make sure he was all right. In the glow of Danny's flashlight, he saw a horrifying image. What Danny saw was a hairless creature that stood 8 foot tall. It had glowing eyes and jagged teeth, and it was biting into the throat of Andy Roberts. Frozen in fear, Danny couldn't scream or run. He stared at the beast as it tore at Andy's flesh. Gunshots rang out through the forest as the other men shot at the creature. The beast dropped Andy's lifeless body to the ground and quickly disappeared into the darkness. The men rushed to Andy's side, but there was nothing they could do. Andy Roberts was dead. As fast as the creature disappeared, it was back again, and it wasn't alone. This time, there were more of them. The three men had no choice. They left Andy's body where it was and ran for their lives. The men ran until they physically couldn't run anymore. They tried to listen into the darkness over their heavy breathing. There was no sign of the creatures. The men knew they had to find their way back to the camp, but they had no idea where they were. The only thing they could do was backtrack out of the woods the same way they came in. The men checked their weapons, then as quietly as they could, they started walking. The men made their way back to where Andy's body was, but the body was gone. The only thing that was there was Andy's rifle. They took the rifle and continued walking, eventually making it back to the dirt road. They knew the camp wasn't far away. As they made their way towards the cabin, the men heard branches breaking from behind them. The men started to run, but it was too late. From out of nowhere, two of the creatures pounced on Ben Pearson. Ben screamed as the beast ripped into his body. Jim Trafton and Danny Myers fired their weapons into the air to try and scare the two beasts away, but the creatures continued to attack Ben. Jim and Danny knew there was nothing more they could do. They both turned and ran to the cabin. They bolted the door and tried to catch their breath. They were both safe for now. Jim Trafton and Andy Myers were both exhausted and horrified. Whatever it was that killed their friends was still outside, waiting for them. Both men knew that before long, the creatures would find a way inside the cabin. From outside, the men could hear the creatures growling. Jim and Danny made a plan. They knew the pickup truck was just outside the cabin. They would have to make a run for it. They checked their weapons and both said a quick prayer. And on the count of 3, they ran for their lives towards the truck. Almost instantly, 2 of the creatures pounced on Jim Trafton. Jim was able to use a large hunting knife to stab at the creatures, but it wasn't enough. Jim's head was ripped from his body as the creatures continued to attack him. Danny turned and fired several shots at the creatures before making it to the pickup truck. Danny drove as fast as he could down the long dirt road that led away from the cabin. He never looked back. It took Danny 45 minutes to reach the state police barracks in Allagash. Once there, he was able to tell his story to Officer Tony Danforth. Officer Danforth could not believe what he was hearing. This wasn't the first time he's heard of creatures in the woods of Allagash. There has been multiple occasions over the years where people go into the woods and never come out. A team of police officers and volunteers were quickly assembled to go back to the camp and search for the missing men. There were large amounts of blood found in the area, but no bodies were located. The search continued for 5 days before finally being called off by the local police. Danny Myers was eventually arrested and charged with the murder of his 4 friends. While in jail awaiting his trial, Danny Myers hung himself. Other inmates heard Danny laughing hysterically just before the guards found him. To this day, the mystery of what happened to these men remains unsolved. It is still considered the biggest unsolved murder case in Maine's history. Are there creatures lurking in the woods of Allagash? We may never know. If you dare, you can try to find out for yourself. Just don't go there in the dark.